On the 7th of June 1099, Crusader forces reached Jerusalem after a long march across the Levant. The city's fall still matters because it reshaped sacred space, power, and memory for centuries. The siege grew out of the First Crusade, launched from Western Europe and driven by faith, politics, and promises of reward. By the time Jerusalem came into view, the campaign had already remade the Eastern Mediterranean. Jerusalem itself had changed hands more than once in the years before 1099. Its rulers were under pressure from regional rivalries, shifting alliances, and the burden of defending a city revered by several faiths. The Crusader leaders were not united by a single vision. They were noble rivals, oath-takers, and survivors of a grueling march, each carrying political obligations and personal ambitions into the final approach. Inside the city, defenders faced their own pressures. Limited supplies, anxious civilians, and the knowledge that relief might not arrive in time. On both sides, morale depended on endurance as much as courage. The armies brought different strengths. The Crusaders relied on infantry, cavalry, siege carpentry, and stubborn discipline, while the defenders used walls, archers, and the advantage of high ground. Logistics mattered as much as weapons. Water, timber, food, and animal fodder were scarce, and every mile of supply stretched the besiegers thinner. The siege was as much a contest of endurance as of force. By early summer, the Crusaders had marched through difficult country and arrived exhausted. They had fought, negotiated, and endured hunger on the way. Yet Jerusalem's walls gave them a new and final purpose. The route to the city cut through dry hills and exposed ridges. That landscape offered little shelter, so movement was visible from far away, and every approach had to be made under the eyes of the defenders. Jerusalem's terrain shaped the siege from the start. Steep slopes, uneven ground, and the city's elevated position limited where engines could be built and where assaults could be launched. The weather was hot, dry, and unforgiving. In that climate, thirst and fatigue could weaken an army faster than battle, and shade became a strategic resource in itself. The Crusader plan depended on pressure from multiple sides and the construction of siege works. They needed to close distance, protect their builders, and create a way over or through the walls. The defenders, by contrast, aimed to preserve time. They relied on the city's fortifications, watched for weak points, and hoped the besiegers would run short of supplies before the walls gave way. As the siege opened, both sides tested each other with movement, scouting, and small attacks. The first days were less about dramatic breakthrough than about measuring strength and finding weakness. The Crusaders also faced internal strain. Command decisions had to be made quickly, but their coalition was broad and their resources uneven, so every choice carried political weight as well as military risk. One pressure point was water. In a dry season, control of wells, cisterns, and access routes could decide whether an army kept its strength long enough to continue the siege. Another pressure point was time. The longer the siege lasted, the more the defenders could hope for relief, and the more the attackers had to improvise with limited materials. The decisive movement came when the Crusaders shifted efforts toward a more vulnerable sector of the defenses. That adjustment reflected reconnaissance, engineering, and a willingness to abandon less promising ground. Building close to the walls was dangerous and slow. Yet once the siege machines were in place, the balance began to change because the attackers could now sustain pressure where the defenders could least afford it. The opening phase of the final assault combined noise, movement, and uncertainty. From a distance, it would have looked like a dense field of shields, ladders, and rolling timber advancing under protection. Defenders answered from the ramparts, and the wall line became a place of constant strain. The contest was not a single moment, but a sequence of pushes, pauses, and renewed effort. As the pressure intensified, a breach or opening became more plausible than before. Siege warfare often turned on such narrow changes where engineering and exhaustion combined to create opportunity. The breakthrough did not happen everywhere at once. Instead, one sector gave way enough to let attackers surge forward, and that local success unbalanced the broader defense. Once the defensive line faltered, the city's fate was effectively sealed. In siege warfare, collapse often came suddenly after long strain. because a wall is only as strong as the men holding it. The immediate aftermath was chaotic and deeply consequential. Control shifted quickly, and the victors moved to secure sacred sites, gates, and key streets before order could be restored. For residents, the change of rule meant uncertainty, displacement, and new arrangements of power. For the conquerors, it meant triumph, but also the burden of governing a city they had taken at enormous cost. In the years that followed, Jerusalem became the center of a new Latin Christian kingdom. That new political order altered alliances, trade, and military strategy across the region. The siege also intensified long memories of loss and conquest. Later generations would remember the event differently, depending on faith, place, and the stories they inherited. Historians still debate details such as troop numbers, command decisions, and the exact sequence of the final assault. The broad outline is clear, but many specifics remain qualified by the sources. The sources themselves were written by participants and later chroniclers with strong viewpoints. That means the siege must be studied carefully, with attention to bias, silence, and exaggeration. Today, Jerusalem is a living city layered over older walls, roads, and sacred spaces. Visitors can still sense how geography and memory continue to shape the place. Standing there, it is easier to understand why the siege mattered so much. The city is small on a map, but enormous in history, and its stones still carry competing memories. The siege of Jerusalem was a military event, a religious turning point, and a human crisis all at once. Its legacy endures because it shows how ambition, belief, and endurance can change history. The story is not only about victory or defeat, it is also about the long aftermath of decisions made under pressure, and about how cities become symbols larger than the people who fought over them. Even now, the siege is studied not as a simple legend, but as a carefully reconstructed historical event. That caution helps keep the past vivid without turning it into myth. What remains is a city, a memory, and a warning about the cost of sacred conflict. Jerusalem's 1099 siege still asks viewers to weigh faith, power, and consequence together.